Good morning. Welcome to latest Cross-8 webinar. Today we are going to be talking about quite a common subject and one we get asked about quite a lot, which is how to sort of lock in lasting change. How to make sure that you don't successfully deliver a program, but you don't actually see the outcome or the benefits that you set out to achieve. Today, really happy to be joined by Alex Atkins, who leads our delivery practice, and Wendy Robinson, who leads our business change practice. Hopefully, what we will do is acknowledge we have quite a strong Kiwi heritage in the company. Equally, we've got most nations represented. This is going to be less topical if you're listening to this on Listen On Demand, but clearly, given the weekend's events, yeah, there's a bit of rugby that might creep in. So today we're going to, as I say, start talking about sort of how to make sure that change is really effective, that you achieve your benefits. Now, I think there's a range of research that's been done. If you look at most of the big sort of consultancies and research houses have got stats of just how many programs fail. And invariably, it's not a failure of the mechanical delivery that gets through, but it just doesn't achieve the benefits that you want to achieve. So today is a lot looking at all the things that sit around a program to really make the overall outcome a success. And this applies to a whole range of programs. You might have some that are a bit narrower, a straight, say, tech infrastructure change that might be quite isolated in terms of business impact. But for most changes, obviously lends itself to where there's a significant tech change underpinning a business change, but equally applies to others. If you're going through a significant reorganization, we've talked previously on different webinars about if, for example, you're doing a significant cost optimization piece. If you haven't got a bunch of these other mechanics in place, if you haven't got true buy-in, as much as you're trying to save costs, other people in the organization are rapidly spending, increasing it. So it's applicable to a whole range of programs. Alex, might start the conversation with you. So in terms of this topic, I mean, what sort of things come to mind when you're starting to see this in terms of sort of common mistakes you see or see key bits that people miss when they're approaching this?
Yeah, thanks, Toby. And I think there are some key areas that we sort of focus in on. There's probably three key area topics that we sort of have in our mind when we're looking about successful change, and about creating the climate, how we set that environment around the change, how we look to enable the change and implement and embed. And I think we've got a number of key points we'll sort of come into those areas as we go through. But that overlying sort of three layer points is probably where we'll sort of zero in on. First, for me, is around creating that climate, is about that clear strategy to shape and control. If the program or project doesn't have that clear strategy, then it can rapidly unpick itself as it goes through the various different stages. As we step between procurement through to build, through to test and deployment, that lack of a clear strategy to understand what the program was trying to deliver in the first place rapidly starts to unpick. And there are some quite key ones that we sort of see, in particular when it comes to large system implementations. We've been in the past been involved in a couple of SAP implementations, and they classically come with a desired approach that led the business to select SAP. And when that sort of manifests itself in the various different stages, is that you then start to unpick itself when starting to apply the local demands that come in, and they sit counter to the overarching strategy that sits within the program, and that manifests itself in some key problem areas. One in particular is you start to bespoke what is a core product, and that core product was selected and through that original strategy, and that bespoking process that sort of kicks through for trying to adapt to the local demands and not the hierarchical program strategy starts to manifest itself into changes, which leads you away into significantly increased cost in build, because you have to adapt to those changes, significant costs in terms of training and process management. And more importantly, when we talk about locking in value, which is what I guess one of the key things we want to get through today, is you're unable to lock that value in because the constant changes that are needed to maintain that bespoking means that you can't lock in the value that was secured in terms of, you know, reduced operational cost around a program delivery. And that really sort of starts to manifest itself in the increased cost to maintain the system. We've seen that in terms of some SAP implementations we've been involved in. And I think some recent ones we've been seeing with Birmingham Council, for example, which is, again, going through that cycle of unpicking the core aims. And when it comes through to delivery, it's finding that cost is significantly increased. And a lot of that is down to bespoking a core product and trying to take it back into what was not originally aimed with the core strategy of the program.
And I think sometimes, Alex, with that, when you have got that strategy set up front and you know where you're heading, but these unexpected changes come along as you're working through it, you kind of find that, you know, the benefits you set out to, what did you want to get at the end of this, don't often get realized, particularly those things around bespoking. So from a technical perspective, you know, techie people get involved in techie things. They don't necessarily remember that strategy, that upfront, what you were planning to strive to deliver at the end. And some changes come along as you're working through it, and they may get, you know, sidetracked at times. So I think it's really clear that everybody through that whole program, right from start to finish, is quite clear on what the outcome is, what benefits do you want to realize at the end of the program. So you keep that, you know, that goal at the end lined up, to enable it to implement.
And to my mind, and this might not be strictly true, but I think it resonates quite strongly with me, is that this is all about business outcomes. So it might be a technical change, but the business outcome associated with that is about, for example, reduced cost to serve. It's a reduced cost coming through from the IT team, or it may be that there is a product that can last for a number of years because it's now in a stable support network. But it's about the business outcome for that, not necessarily technical change just driving that through. And I think where programs can get lost is that they go, as you say, over focused on the technical elements that resonate within that, and not acknowledging that really it's about the business outcomes that need to be achieved and how that can then unlock value in the business, which is what fundamentally, you know, the program should be trying to achieve.
And I think something that can really help that throughout the program life cycle is the right sponsorship, the right business people involved throughout the program. So if you've got clear what you want to get at the end of it, and your sponsor is an active sponsor, so I'm a true believer an active sponsor is really key in a program, you know, not being there and not being available when you need to make those tough decisions, make the right decisions around, should this change happen or not happen, you know, what is the right thing. I think having those active sponsors in it, and also those sponsors being someone that's going to be an end user or an end believer in what's coming to them at the end. So it's, you know, the benefits are bought into throughout the program life cycle, that they're helping make sure that everybody's, you know, aligned and expecting the same thing at the end of the program. So I think that's very key.
Yeah, and I think it's, because again, resonating back with some past examples of where sponsorships work really well, it's not so much that the sponsor feels the benefit of the change, because that's commonly where you see it again, but they're also feeling the pain of the change. And that pain can be associated back to, you know, operational changes that need to occur, that actually may not always necessarily be as strongly associated to some of the benefits. They may be cut across different areas, but ensuring that sponsorship covers both the pleasure and the pain, I think is fundamental as well. But as you say, that with that deep understanding and locked into the program, you're really able to facilitate stronger decision making that goes through the program. Which also probably leads in my head to how we talked about that sort of create the climate and then enabling the change, is that how you keep that strategy alive through the life of the program, I think is also 100% fundamental as well. The concept of it being locked at the start and then just constantly delivered and held to all the way through, again, is a massive flag in terms of issues that we've seen in other programs. And that live sponsorship to be able to review that original strategy, ensure that it's still aligned with the business objectives, really starts to resonate strongly when it comes to successful delivery. There are a number of classic cases where we've seen an inflexible approach taken, a strategy that was decided 2 or 3 years ago, held to constantly through the program, admirable in some ways from a cost perspective, but unable to really unlock business value because the business has changed around the program, hasn't the business has gone forward and reacted to the world, and the program must adapt to that as well. And if it stays in a static position, it's not a real position. The world changes on a regular basis, and to stay locked into an approach, it just it means you can't really fundamentally unlock the value.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I imagine most of the audience will have certainly been through some of those, whether they realise or not, depending on whether they're on a program. So clearly, a lot of our team worked on utilities on smart metering over the last sort of 10 to 15 years. That was a classic sort of regulatory, government-driven change program, but running over so many years that it naturally evolved. A lot of uncertainty through the early stages. And partly companies were successful depending on how much they could adapt and move with that and effectively manage uncertain scope. But to your point, Alex, if the more rigid the approach, the more impact to cost and time in terms of trying to adapt later on when whatever they're designing is out of date. Probably the thing that's that everybody could relate to is clearly the impact of COVID. So any large multi-year change program trying through COVID, clearly there's a number of themes that have been going on in the world and around digitization and other technologies enabling new ways of working. But pre-COVID, that was very much that might take 10 years plus to get to. And then overnight, COVID changed a lot of how things work, things that even just, for example, the scale of home working when it came to regulations and controls. I'm thinking you couldn't possibly run a remote environment in, for example, a financial service operation. And yet COVID caused everybody to need to do that. But it means any of the large programs that have been running into COVID has suddenly changed, sort of facing quite a different way of operating, both in terms of opportunities as well as impacts. But again, it's how well they responded to that as opposed to just being out of date by the time they went live. Interesting. So we've touched on a number of the sort of almost sort of the big themes in terms of setting the program up for success. So we talked about obviously having the right program strategy and how that aligns to the business strategy. I think in some places we see a real disconnect between even when the program has a strategy, but it's not quite clear how that fits with the overall business. The business, particularly when it's evolving technology or evolving regulations. But that's quite a hard change journey for an organization to buy into when the two things don't match. We talked about having a clear view of benefits. Interesting one around business case. So seen a few even quite recently where the outcomes that the business wanted to achieve in terms of modernization, in terms of change of culture, in terms of change of working, just weren't reflected in terms of the investment and the mechanics that were outlined in the business case. So even directly within the business case, it sort of outlined those bigger business outcomes they wanted to achieve, but then the only spend was on direct technology. And clearly you can see those sort of mismatches that a pure tech-enabled program without any recognition of process redesign, reorganization, change of ways of working is not going to work. We talked about sponsorship and sort of how that flows into the wider leadership across an organization has to own and want the change. The other one that's probably worth calling out in terms of just that top set of one that again is sort of seen in a few places is objectives, which seems a really small mechanical thing. But quite frankly, if like lots of organizations run to objectives, align bonuses to objectives, if those objectives don't pick up the program, the outcomes of the program, then you're asking people in the organization to drive and prioritize the new change that's coming through, but the way they're measured incentivizes them to focus on different areas on BAU. So that one ends up being quite a mechanical one, but it's it's the adage, what gets measured gets done. It's little things like that means the program can be fighting all the way through to actually implement some of these things. Probably quite an interesting one to touch on. Then we touched a bit about how design needs to change sort of multi-year, but be worth touching on operating model. in terms of how companies go about thinking or not thinking about wider impacts on operating model. Does one of you want to sort of what's views?
Yeah, I think it's again, for my mind, it's about, with that strategy set, is where is the value truly unlocked in the delivery, and some of that is associated to technical changes, things we were just covering off a minute ago. But some of that effectively is unlocked by changing the operating model, changing how the business is structured, changing how roles are set up, and having a true understanding of what that target state operating model is, the stages that go to unlock that, how that is delivered by the program is a fundamental step in my mind, because without that true understanding of the operating model change, we come back to some of the other examples where that's not been done. So those operating model changes are not properly understood, or if they are understood, the importance of them hasn't resonated, and thereby we've slotted it down for activity that a supervisor role needs to change, and that becomes an activity that's sort of done, sort of not done. But if the true change in terms of that supervisor role may be the true unlocking of the value within the program, refocusing activity around a redefinition of a role, an enablement of people to do either new activities on the back of those changes. But without that true implementation, you effectively end up at risk of carrying the old operating model with the new system designed around a new operating model, and you end up with a clash. And that can manifest itself in loss of value, but it can also manifest itself in operational confusion about what a role should be achieved, what's required for that role. And that might relate back then to some of the technology aspects, but fundamentally it can revolve around to, what is the responsibilities that sit around inside that operator model. And we've seen that operate on a regional basis, where poor understanding between different regions and how to apply those roles becomes different. And difference, as we were covering a minute ago, starts to increase costs, because you end up having to tolerate two operating models operating within the same system. And that causes significant complexity and process cost, and really, again, starts to challenge how you lock that value in, because if you haven't got a secured new operating model, you haven't really secured that lasting value within the business.
I think a good example, I've been involved in a few programs. Some of you on this call today have probably seen me on some of these programs, where at the beginning they've thought about what they want to achieve, but they haven't thought about the end. They haven't thought about the people. They haven't thought about how the processes are going to work to align those benefits back to where we wanted in the first place. So as part of the operating model, they haven't maybe considered how those people are going to adapt, or how are those people going to change roles. I think many people, when a change program starts, the first thing comes to mind quite often is, oh God, I'm out of a job. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean you're out of a job. Quite often it means you're going to move to something that's maybe better. You might enjoy it more. There's really good opportunities to do that. On a program a few years ago for me now, there was a number of supervisors, quite a few thousand, out in a field force environment. They were receiving new tech, and the whole point was the processes that were coming with this new tech were going to enable the business to see better value, better ways for these guys to do the job they were doing on the ground. Unfortunately, no one had thought about how those people felt. They felt that they were being replaced by this new piece of technology. And how could it possibly be that this new technology was going to take over their role? And actually, when you sit back and look at it, they weren't taken through that journey. They weren't, consulted at the beginning, brought into the program, part of that whole change process to understand why this is a benefit to them. And it took quite a lengthy program. I came into it very late in the day to that program, and it was quite challenging to change the mindset, because in their heads, I'm being taken out by a computer. I think, there's an awful lot of things out in the world these days that people go, well, robots are going to take, there's a lot of things that can take over, but actually it still needs that human interaction, that human work in some cases, but getting them to understand that they're not, not in that position. So that program was great. It was challenging. There was a lot of, to the point you've made, Alex, about regions, there was a lot of regional discussions, because the UK does have a different way of working in many places, and so it's getting that sort of alignment into place was a bit of a challenge.
And I think that leverages back into sponsorship as well, isn't it? Because there's one point is finding the problems, another point is unlocking those problems, and and with the right the right program management to identify the issues and capture and present that back to your sponsor for discussion. But it's then really engaging with your sponsor to make the key decisions to enable you to unlock those problems, because they often relate to harmonizing roles across areas, and which is challenging, harmonizing across regions, which again is challenging, but it can only be done with senior leadership and sponsorship buy-in. And I think that's where you've got to get that interaction working to be able to facilitate and deliver the issues that you find. And too often you can fall into a trap where either the problem isn't articulated clearly for the sponsorship team to make the decision, or they're unable to make that decision, in which case you probably have to come back to one of the core questions you're referring to at the start, Wendy, is making sure, have we identified the right person to be the sponsor? Have they actually got the power to be able to support the project?
Really interesting, sort of taking those lessons to just where we are. Wendy touched on it in terms of the amount of technology that's coming out. The reality is we are going to go through an AI transformation across the world. That is going to, we're already seeing that, starting to automate large amounts of existing jobs. And really interesting one, back to that point, it's going to change the way we work, but that doesn't mean that all the people that change applying to are out of their jobs and therefore redundant. It changes the value set. But it's going to be really interesting how different companies go about trying to go through that whole change journey, because it's such an obvious one that's going to meet resistance, be seen as a negative experience for quite a lot of people if they're on the receiving end of their jobs are getting automated. I think some of the most successful companies are the ones that are going to be able to paint that future, articulate what the new operating model is going to look like, particularly where those roles are needed, but they're moving to higher value ones that they're able to differentiate, as opposed to sort of a transactional race to the bottom. Probably worth touching on, because one of the things I think we would see across a lot of companies, both ones we work with and others, is probably, we've touched on some of the points, but the misnomers around business change. I guess business change quite often gets written off as it's a bit of comms and maybe some training at the end. Obviously, we've touched on quite a lot of the points, but actually, in order to make that a success, it's a lot of the points that we started on in terms of how do you set it up from the beginning, in terms of the strategy, painting that vision, aligning leadership, driving, they're all the mechanics. So there might be some mechanical bits at the end, but just be interested in any thoughts you to have on that.
I think from a change perspective, one of the misnomers, I think, for me, is people think it's only big change. It's got to be just those massive big programs that you've got going on. But 9 times out of 10, the thing that people fall over is the smaller ones that sit around that. You know, there's never just one program going on in a big organization, or even a small organization. There's multiple things happening at the same time. And I think the key to that has got to be communications and making sure that people understand what's happening, take them through the journey, make them understand what impacts there are or not impacts to them. Because the other bit, the flip side to that is, particularly in a smaller organization, you might be sitting there going, well, I've always done it this way. Why would I change? It's not going to impact me. But actually, it's those people that you want to go, actually, do you know what? It isn't going to impact you. You're going to be okay. But your colleagues over here are going to be impacted. So it's making sure that wider group is aware of what's happening. Don't just assume that you're just talking to the one person that's impacted. You're talking to the wider group that are impacted as well.
Yeah, that resonates in another area we probably may come on to some future webinars around portfolio management and how we look at portfolios. You're one of a series of changes that is occurring in a business area, and unless you see that in the context of all the change that's going into that space, then yeah, it's a very naive approach that no project is an island, is probably what goes through my head a lot of the time. We are part of a wider ecosystem of changes impacting the business, and those need to be joined up and they need to be explained to the impacted teams. And if they're not, then there is you get to a similar scenario that we've had with some clients where we go in there where there is a phenomenal amount of work that they're trying to land into operational areas and just expecting that change to be absorbed. And there is a physical capacity to how much change can be taken in by teams, and blind delivery of just pushing that work through in isolation, and projects do have the delightful approach of just keeping the blinkers down just to keep going and deliver their own scope and not really seeing the bigger picture. So yeah, linking into that broader portfolio of work that's affecting operational teams, I think is part of making sure that change both locks in, but is also integrated into the way that they're working.
I think some organizations I've been in have had change leads, and these are great. Change leads are great if they understand the impacts of multiple programs or projects into that area. If you're looking particularly in an operational space, they may just helicopter in once a month, do a change meeting, but they're not living and breathing what the teams are doing day to day and understanding the multiple change impacts that they're facing. Some organizations have winter constraints or even summer constraints on when they can do certain programs, and I think often the people that are trying to help with that change can maybe hinder it. So I think it's really important that those change leads understand the business, actually write in it, living and breathing it, so that they are part of understanding the wider impacts. I think, sometimes I've been in a big program and small things have come along and they can fit in. And it's just the matter of having the conversation. Other bigger programs have sat there and gone, do you know what? We're the important one. Forget about anything else. It's only what we do that matters.
And getting that balance is quite hard, because you want that business to be at the heart of your decision making. And we're not. I think it's a step down from SRO. Probably we're talking about it's the business owner that sort of sits embedded within the program, and if that interaction is too isolated, you can end up where you've got the dedicated time from your business owner. They're sat within the project team, but if they're not effectively linked back out to the operational business, then their awareness of what is actually going on in the day-to-day in the operational sense rapidly diminishes. If you're not in the normal stand-ups, for example, that go on a day-to-day basis, you're not feeling that day-to-day pain, then you become very much project focused and not business focused. But if you flip the other way around and become overly business focused, you get to where you were a minute ago, that you're not providing enough input into the program, project's not getting its steerage from the business side of things, and we go the other way around, where effectively there's just not enough engagement in the program to help set direction. So it's fundamentally you've got to get that balance right. And things like setting up model offices can be brilliant ideas, because you want to create an incubator for a program to set itself up in terms of new processes, new setups, new procedures, set that new world. But if that world is so separated from the old world, then you end up with a challenge where you've created the risk is you end up with a delivery in a bubble that really hasn't really sort of reflected the wider world, and becomes over focused on its own objectives, and not, again, coming back to where we were at the start, what is the business strategy, what's the business outcome that we're trying to achieve here. And if we're not careful, then that bubble scenario ends up being all about the project in its own scope, and not really about where the business should be going, or what the business wants to get out of the program.
There's a number of tools that sort of help that whole process. If anybody's listening to this who wants some, we're happy to just message us, we can share. All the way from sort of change roadmap, heat maps, impact assessments, all tied to trying to take it up a level from looking directly at that project or program and wrap it into something bigger, really to understand that change fatigue and some of the points that you both touched on. One of the interesting ones, and we published an article last year on it, was probably going more into the portfolio stuff, so we might touch on it a bit more in a later webinar. But people will quite often, when they're trying to run a sort of change prioritization, change planning exercise, obviously budget from a finance sense, that's a given. There's a finite amount of money, you've got to make the case. In technology worlds, whether it's a sort of old style, sort of waterfall, SAP, RISE-Fs, or it's an agile world, finite capacity within a release schedule, in whatever method or style you're doing it. But the other one that sort of suggested in the article was actually, how do you budget the sort of change allowance? How do you recognize a sort of maximum capacity for each of the functions, and then understand when you're going through that first planning process? You don't really want to be quite a way into a change program that you can't stop or delay without significant costs, and then realize you're overloaded. So in terms of that planning process, given that the whole point is to get that business adoption and make sure they can properly use it, and at the same time it moves the business forward rather than significantly hampering it, it's quite an interesting one of how you can actually apply sort of a capacity model to that as well, so that you're prioritizing, and right up front you're spotting maybe key pinch points. Invariably in organizations you're going to have capacity to roll out in different areas. It's particular pinch points, whether it's finance or ops or whoever is getting hit by multiple changes. But it's an interesting one how you try and optimize that up front rather than reacting into it downstream, versus they just don't even recognizing it until you're fighting to get your change heard and in and successful.
No, 100%, and the heat map approach is key to that, because as you say, it's often the areas. There's some obvious ones that you lead into, the finance one, but you can be surprised sometimes by where you've ended up with a concentration of change, and that without having that true lens to identify that, as you say, you are very much at the risk of chance and stumbling into having an implementation problem that you've got. And there's some of the other areas of business that we've worked in have strong regulatory changes, and they have key deadlines that have to be hit. So often then it becomes a question of not when can I do it, is I have to do it by these dates, and then delivery becomes compromised because of that. And I think 100% agree, it's that fundamental view of seeing where the impacts are, planning those over time, and understanding which bits can be moved and can't be moved, because there are some non-discretionary items that just have to be delivered in operational businesses. And to bolt the discretionary and the non-discretionary together and just continue regardless leads to some of the impacts that we've seen when we've looked at some large programs and why they're not landing change, because they're just landing too much, and some of that needs to effectively be reprioritized to make sure that it delivers effectively.
One that would be good to touch on, you mentioned it before, but it'd be worth maybe elaborating, well, not least because it's a while since I've come across one of the programs that have gone down this approach, but the whole sort of model office approach is a really interesting one, right? Because when it's done well, it's a way of really bringing a change to life, to testing it, to try and create something the business engage with. But it'd just be good if we can expand a bit more on that.
Yeah, I think it's, as I say, you've got to get the balance right with it. We've seen some really good examples where we've set up using good, strong sponsorship. We've pulled strong leads from the business that understand how to operate the business, but we've set them up in a model office environment. And the real pleasure of a model office is it allows you to test out new processes and procedures without them with providing the support that's required when you've got a new process that you're trying to do. Smart metering was a classic case of that, because it fundamentally changed how processes and procedures were operated. And the first time they were put into action, we knew that it was the first time that we had to go and rewrite the process. So you have to make sure there's a bubble around those teams to make sure that they can be supported effectively and grow the processes and procedures and effectively become the new experts of the business. The danger with that is that you then end up, and there are other examples where we've seen it not work as effectively, where that bubble approach becomes, if you've not selected the right people and if they've not maintained links back up into the existing operations, is that they start to create processes that aren't effective, that aren't capable of being rolled out at scale. And you start that challenge of the model office becomes that separation of the model office, which gives you focus, starts to become a problem because it doesn't allow you to embed that back into the main business. I think the key thing that we've seen in terms of successful deployments of model offices is that you have a defined strategy to go into a pilot that you're operating has a clear focus. You know what you're trying to learn out of that pilot. You know that what you're trying to achieve, and that gives you an exit strategy from that pilot phase. The bad examples that we've seen is where pilots continue to operate. They continue to have to need that support network that sits around that, and you then are unable to mature that pilot and that model office into something that can be successfully handed back across into operational teams. And if you haven't got that clear exit strategy, then you run the risk of continuing to have to handhold the business effectively through a number of clear processes and strategies. So it's a balancing act that needs to be understood. But again, I think the clear takeaway that we found for successful ones is that they have a strategy, they understand what their strategy is, and they've got a clear exit plan that enables that to be morphed back into the business. So you end up effectively with a new operating model, not a pilot structure that only really survives if you continue to look after it in a highly supported way.
That's brilliant. That's really good. And that's probably a good point to sort of bring this conversation to a close. I think if obviously if you're listening live, we'll send out the links. We'll also share frameworks. If you're listening on demand, if any of these things are resonating, we have some infographics, we have frameworks, more than happy to send across. Hopefully, which just gives you a bit of structure and demystifies some of the things we've touched on. A lot of the things that mechanics that I think make your change a success are relatively straightforward, but it's literally knowing how they all fit together, knowing what they all are, and making sure that they're in place. And equally, the earlier you can capture it, the better chance you have of making your change work, rather than sort of finding that out through pain at the end. But thank you very much for listening. Alex, Wendy, thank you very much. And we will leave it there.
Thank you.
Thank you.